What do you want to tell the world, Nichole?
I think that all of us have a point in our career as we're ascending where we essentially get to what could be considered a plateau, right? Where we either believe that we're being looked at as if we've reached our plateau, or we may even believe it ourselves. And so to me, that's the getting stuck. And it's when you believe that you have additional runway, how do you essentially get yourself beyond that plateau? The breakthrough was to go and win.
Welcome to Bold Breakthroughs today. I am thrilled to have Nichole Wiley-Marks, a vice president of all things demand and revenue generation at Included Health. But she's also spoken so glowingly about her 17-year career in Aero Technologies that it's like she wants to work for two places, but she just can't. She had to follow her destiny and her opportunity for her family. So we're going to talk about both in her personal life and who she is. And she is an extraordinary person. I can't wait to share her with you.
Scott Peck, in his timeless book, The Road Less Traveled, once said, "Once it is accepted, the fact that life is difficult no longer matters." I'm not even sure if Nichole Wiley-Marks has read The Road Less Traveled on her way from Ohio to Denver across her career, but she has sure embraced this attitude for her career success. In a moment, one of the finest human beings I have recently met, Nichole Wiley-Marks.
Welcome to Bold Breakthroughs that unstick work and life. I'm Mark Cook, New York Times bestselling innovator. Each week I offer keynotes that engage thousands, and teams embed me weekly to unstick tech pivots, sales prospects, and ops constraints. We roll up our sleeves in small groups to create breakthroughs on top priorities for each individual, in person or via Zoom. 9 global studies of over 2 million successes have fueled my 4,000 wins at top brands. I've shared rapid innovation in over 50 cities worldwide. Teams create revenue breakthroughs and clients see new profits. Thank you for listening and inspiring your breakthrough today.
How are you today, Nichole?
I'm doing well, Mark. How are you? Happy to be here.
Oh, great. I'm doing great, and I'm so happy you're here. I want to start out at the beginning of a few aspects of your life and not jump to the end, but just kind of dwell and explore how to get unstuck before we explore breakthroughs. I wanted to talk first about your early career. You've had an interesting early career that included some obstacles and some things to get around. Could you just tell us the story of your early career for a minute?
Yeah, absolutely. So really, coming directly out of college, the first thing I did was I went to go and work in the telecom space. And some would probably look back at that time and say, I was certainly on the fast track. That's what we called it back in those days, which meant that, every year or so or less, I was going off to do something else. I was kind of ascending up the corporate ladder, and everything looked bright. The future looked very, very bright.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, I made a transition from AT&T, which is where I first started in the telecom space, to a company called WorldCom that no longer exists today. Most people know today as Verizon Business. But at that time, WorldCom had been tagged as the darling of Wall Street. And unfortunately, at some point, this is back in the Enron days when there was, early 2000s, when there were a couple of debacles that ultimately ended with us having Sarbanes-Oxley as we have today. Those things were put in place specifically for these types of situations. WorldCom actually was all over the news as a result of stating revenue, which then meant that it was the largest corporate bankruptcy in history.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of a sudden, where I had gone from, this fast track and this promise, it ended with me, being impacted by this event and ultimately finding myself back in the market and what felt like starting over in my career.
It's a hard thing when things around you disintegrate. Could you just describe finding out the early moments? You probably knew before a lot of the rest of us, and what it did to your internal conversation, thoughts, and feelings, and how that rippled out.
Right. I think number one, the important thing to note is that it was in an important time in our economy. This is during the time frame of the dot-com bust. So certainly a polar opposite economy as the one that exists today, right? I would consider today's economy as a job seekers market, right? There is ultimately more supply than there is demand. So it was a different time in our history in that you knew that if you were impacted, you probably weren't going to necessarily find a job really quickly. That was the probability at that time. What I would tell you though is, yes, I did know before a lot of people, in the world knew about what ultimately was going to be titled as or pegged as the WorldCom debacle. But during that time frame, I was lucky, actually. I lasted a little bit beyond the actual debacle, and I knew that I was kind of working myself out of the job. So I knew it was going to be inevitable that I would have to start over. At the point where I did have to begin to look at what my next steps were going to be, I will tell you that my mind was probably my greatest enemy in the sense that I was down on myself. I was down on my inner voice, ultimately was saying, oh my gosh, you're going to now have to go out and convince someone of how great, right, that you think that you had been in your career at WorldCom as well as at AT&T. And as many of us know, even internally within our companies, when we get a new boss, that can bring on some uncertainty in that we have to prove ourselves again to that new boss. So take that and flip it, bring yourself outside in the market, and ultimately knowing that you're going to have to grapple with the fact that you're going to have to convince someone that you're worth them taking a shot on. But not only that, that now you may actually have to take a step back in order to spring forward.
You had to wrestle with yourself to decide, I've worked really hard in my life to be this, and now I'm going to have to step 2 steps back or 1 step back in order to get 2 or 3 forward. What were you thinking about stepping backwards?
Right. I would tell you it was hard. I mean, it was definitely hard because I think that at the end of the day, you can build up some animosity, right? Because you feel like, gosh, I've worked this hard. I've gone to school. I came out. I busted, my butt, for lack of better terms, in all the things that I previously did to get to where I am. And now the question is again, how is it that I'm going to, I guess, resume, right? Take off from that point. And, one of all of us have to have that voice of reason in our lives. And for me, in that particular instance, it was definitely my mom, who, of course, most of our moms are greatest allies. They are advocates for us. They are our biggest fans, right? And the thing that she said that still stands out to me this day was Nikki, which is again my nickname. She basically said, cream always rises to the top. And it was her way of letting me know that although I may have to take a step back or 2 steps back, that ultimately that work ethic that I had put in, that work ethic that I have, that talent that I ultimately have, that somebody was going to recognize that that was the case, and that I would continue to ascend, past wherever it is that I would have to launch my career next.
And where is your mom giving you this amazing advice from? What city?
Dayton, Ohio. I'm originally from Dayton, Ohio, born and raised, but I live in Denver, Colorado now.
And is she still there?
She is still there.
So you were having a lot of phone calls.
Still my greatest fan.
I'll bet. What was the step backward?
Yeah, so it was truly a step backwards. At that time it was like, hey, I think I anticipate it's going to be a step backwards, but it really was. And so um that pivot is what brought me to Aero Electronics, which you talked about earlier, Mark. I had left WorldCom at that time at kind of the director level at that point in my career, and I was pretty young. And then I kind of pivoted and came into an organization which was Aero, a distributor in the IT space, and came in as a first level manager. I took literally a 50% pay cut as to where I was at WorldCom and walking into Aero. Where I was lucky, though, I would tell you, is that the folks who interviewed me at the time coming into Aero, their actual statement was that they believed that they had hired up. And what hired up it typically means is, the term is that, hey, we believe that this person is qualified beyond this position. We believe that we have runway. We believe that there's potential here for this person to have longevity within the organization. And so I was really, really blessed, if you will, that they at least recognized that they recognized that. So they kind of had their eye on me coming into the organization. But I would tell you that it probably took me 5 to 7 years just from the standpoint of even salary level to get back to where I had left off. But what I would also say is that saying of kind of being the little fish in a big pond versus the big fish in a smaller pond, I do believe that although Aero is a major company, a Fortune 100 company, WorldCom at the time that I worked at WorldCom had over 100,000 employees. I then walk into Aero where there were less than 15,000 employees at that time. And my ability to impact things became much more relevant than even they were at that time. So the question, really is in those cases is, what is really your span of influence versus, hey, I had a good position, I was ascending through the organization, but really what would have been my long-term impact, if you will, on WorldCom versus what it subsequently was for Aero.
Well, let me ask you a question, and you may not even be able to answer that, and it's fine because you did succeed. I've had a few decades in my own career. I've also been around a ton of clients with a ton of employees, and that hiring promise, like, we think that you're promotable right from the start. We think we could advance you quickly. We think you're overqualified for what we're doing, but let's hire you anyway. That is offered so much, way too much. I'm not sure it's genuine most of the time, but I because of my exposure with you and just meeting you over the past few weeks and investigating what you've done, I believe they really meant it about you. But it's still, from that point, there are forces that didn't let them hire you as a vice president. And you certainly weren't going to be an executive off the bat. It was a road. It was a few things to a lot of things. Tell us the steps. Tell us not necessarily just the job that, we hear those words all the time, but what did you have to do? You drove into the parking lot, or you arrived on Skype back then, Zoom now. What was it you did to fulfill that reality?
Yeah, I would tell you, so there's a couple of things, and you're right. How many times have organizations said this, and then you get in and you feel like you're like stuck, like literally stuck somewhere, and you can't get past that point, or it takes too long. What I would tell you for me was, and I talk about this a lot to those who I mentor, number one, I think that I work well in the gray. And when I say the gray, I'm saying I work well in things that are uncertain. So that means then that ugly thing, right? That ugly, I call it the ugly baby that maybe no one else wants to tackle or take on. I was always willing to say, yep, I'll go and do that. right? Yep, I'm raising my hand. I will go and tackle this thing that probably is going to be uncomfortable. I may actually risk failing at what this thing is because it may be big, it may be some huge problem statement for the organization, or it may be a big, huge part of our strategy, right? I was always willing to go and do those things with the uncertainty of what may be on the other side of it. So it wasn't as if I was saying, hey, I'll go and do this. And if I do this, then you owe me this, or I want you to give me this, right? So I did a lot of things, not necessarily knowing how it was going to pay off. I think, I always say to people, I take risk, but they're somewhat calculated risk, right? So my thing is always, what is the worst that could happen? Is it that they don't reward me on the back end of it? But even if that does not happen, what is the skill set or the skill that I would have gained in going to do that ultimately is going to make me more marketable, either inside or outside of this organization? So that's always how I looked at every assignment, essentially, that I took on. Obviously, work ethic was huge. I always was the person who went above and beyond. And then I would tell you that building relationships was super important. So, I over time built so many effective relationships within the organization that I knew people, everywhere, but I had a reputation of people trusted me, right? That things would get done. And, overall, as they say, when the discussion is happening as it pertains to whatever that next opportunity is, the question is when you're not in the room in which you're being discussed, what are they saying about you in that room? So when that next opportunity comes up, is your name being floated as one of the possibilities? And that's super, super, super important.
Yeah, to have a sponsor in that room is critical. I want to talk about that in a minute as part of what you described, how you not just got unstuck, but then created a breakthrough for yourself. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about the bucket that you get put in. You get put in a lot of buckets. The obvious, you identify as female and African American and minority. You have a lot of buckets you've been put in. And from a personal standpoint, I think we should address that a bit and talk about getting stuck in some of those. Could you talk about that a little bit back in those days?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I would tell you, one of the challenges I believe that I did encounter or have encountered in my career, specifically within the IT space, but definitely within the IT channel, what we call the channel, right? Which is kind of the sell-through model for all of the large, IT companies that many of us know, the IBMs, the Oracles, the Palo Altos, the VMwares, the Dells, et cetera, right? They all utilize a channel to go to market, and that's ultimately where Arrow sits. In that channel, it is very much male and white dominated. And so to see a person like me at the executive levels within the channel tend to be rare even today in 2021. And so certainly throughout my career journey, that certainly, provided some challenges for me. And it presented me with an opportunity of how do I overcome that challenge. I would tell you that I think that to a certain extent, some of the challenges sometimes we put on ourselves in terms of the lack of confidence or the limitations that we place onto ourselves in terms of being able to advocate for one, not having a lot of confidence, if you will, in terms of your voice being heard and feeling as if your voice is important. Those were all things that were challenges. So I had to deal not only with the challenge that just says she's a woman and she's a minority, but also with the challenge of the things that I inflicted on myself. The way I overcame those was that I had to become my own best advocate. Okay, so back to kind of the sponsorship statement, Mark, I would tell you that in all honesty, I didn't really have a sponsor throughout my career. Okay, I had some people who would be willing to advocate for me, again, because what I did was I took away excuses based on that work ethic, based on the exposure, based on some of those things. But in terms of actually having a sponsor, at some point, that sponsor didn't exist. And so what I had to do was to go out and seek advocacy, if you will. I had to go out and seek that sponsorship, right? And so I think that that's a place where we really need to, as leaders, as executive leaders, and I try to do this in my mentorship of people, is to really provide that sponsorship where I think that it's needed at times, where you have someone that is really, really, really talented, but for lack of, whatever, they don't necessarily have sponsorship. And that's super, super important, because you can have all the talent in the world, but again, in that room where you're not sitting, and when you don't know what's being said about you, who's saying what, and that's the most important thing. So for me, I'll just give one working example. When I was a director and I felt that it was now time for me to become a VP, one of the things that I did was I literally went and met with every officer within the company to basically let it be known that I believe, number one, that I was ready, but number two was to get their feedback as to the things that they felt that I still needed to do in order to get that accomplished. It did two things. One, it helped me to ultimately know what I had to do. But number two, which is most important, everybody knew what my intention was. And sometimes I think we think that someone is going to come and just tap us on the shoulder because of the hard work that we've done and say, oh yeah, here's the prize. But at some point, as you're ascending, it's a lot about yourself advocating and making sure that people understand what your intentions are and what your goals are.
Yeah, that's so important. I want to dissect it a little bit, because you are a great example of this, and I think for obvious reasons and not so obvious reasons, you are a perfect example of what to do because of the difficulties and the stuckness, the obstacles that you faced. And what a lot of us find, a lot of the employees of my clients, even I have in my own career, you try to gain advocacy. You go watch the TED Talks on it. You read about how to find champions and get them, and you follow the steps, and you don't have a champion. And yet, you've lived this. You don't preach it. You don't just write about it. You've lived it a couple of times now. So if someone who's got serious obstacles to actually having an internal champion is one thing, but even for a small company, it's similar, because you can have even a few successful clients as an entrepreneur, and you still have to find one client that's willing to say, no, I will go to bat for you. It's very similar to being in a 100,000 person organization, and you need an executive to say, no, I'm top 5 in this organization, and no one will turn you down, and I will progress you. So you had to stumble. Give us an example of stumbling, not getting a champion, having rejection or failure to get one, and what you did to get it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, kind of going back to that example that I gave, where literally I went across what we call the EC, which is, all of the officers of the company. I had to go and really advocate for myself. At some point, I had a leader at that time who was big on, I guess I would call it the visuals, right? How it looked, okay? His argument was, and I think his hesitance, I should say this, his hesitance was that it absolutely stood out, obviously, that I was not only a woman, but that I was a minority. And I think that he had the opposite scenario going on, which was, I don't want to go and advocate too hard for this person because I don't want it to seem as if I am doing this only because that person is a woman as well as a minority. My feedback to him at that time is, but if we define what the litmus test is, right, and I am exceeding that litmus test, then we've taken away all excuses that says that it looks like, right, on the surface that potentially you're doing this because of that. That then led me to understand that I could not depend on that person as being my sponsor, right? Although every single year when it came time for him to talk about me at the talent level, he was always giving me these stellar marks. He was always putting me in what we call the hypo bucket, right? High performer, high potential. But when it then came time to say, but who are we going to make, right? Who are we going to put into these vice president positions, which were always discussed at the EC level? For some reason, that that spirit, right, that said, I'm going to fight, I'm going to go beyond just that question, did not exist for him. Okay. And again, I think it was because of what he believed that it was going to look like visually, potentially, versus what was the right thing to do. So yeah, I had to get up enough nerve to basically go and really fight, if you will, but really just become my own best advocate in going and having that discussion with those individuals. And luckily, at some point, those individuals were the ones who, when it came up for discussion annually the next time, basically said, what are we doing? You know, why are we talking about this individual every year and saying that they're a great performer, that they get stuff done, that they're an effective leader, but we actually have not legitimized her, essentially. I was already doing the job, by the way. When they ended up making me the vice president, scope didn't change. And that was the argument, was that I'm doing the job now, but it took me advocating for myself in order for that to occur and essentially, Mark, gain some sponsorship, right, through that advocacy, self-advocacy. So,
yeah, I think a related topic that applies to salespeople trying to develop new prospects, salespeople trying to get referrals, technologists that have an object that's giving them a difficult time and their team's on it. They have to reach outside their team and their network and find new experts that are adjacent to their space. You know, the successful people in work life are constantly broadening their expert network, not for gain or just jobs or closing deals or finding new prospects, but just to learn, to have an information interview, to get new ideas that are possibilities for the future that can create a breakthrough. There seems to be a role somewhere in your finding sponsorship and getting past those views of people like that. Tell me a little bit about the role that your career has found in extending your network, and maybe an example.
Right. So actually, this is a great segue because I think it takes off from, you know, this self-advocacy and me having to go out and essentially gain this sponsorship for me becoming a vice president. Shortly after that, you know, let's fast forward, you know, a couple of years. I think all of us experience in our career at some point, regardless of what level we are at, where we feel as if we've plateaued, right? Whether it's ourselves, we feel ourselves that we've plateaued, or we believe that there is a sentiment within the organization that you no longer have any runway. Mm-hmm. And so similar to what I spoke about earlier, where I said, well, you know what, they were putting me in this hypo bucket every year, you know, all of these things. The reality of what I knew was that I felt as if I had been typecasted, right? I had been typecasted essentially as what we would call an operator, right? It was Nichole gets stuff done. She knows the business. She knows people all across the, you know, every functional area. Literally, she knows this thing end to end. She's super effective. However, not so sure that she would be in line for succession as, let's call it, a business unit president, okay? Because of the fact that she really, at this point, while she's run sales operations, she hasn't really run a whole commercial sales organization. And specifically within our industry, to ascend to, let's say, a CEO or COO or a business unit president, you would certainly have had to run a business unit. And so for me, it was, I have got to get out of this typecast mode and get folks wrapped around the fact that I can go and run a business unit. And so what I did was, well, number one, kind of taking a step back, which would just be absolutely a demonstration of the fact that I certainly was being tagged as a hypo, was the fact that one of the things that you find within organizations is that they're going to make investments in you, right? Typically, that's your indicator that, hey, we think this person has potential, so we're going to make investments, whether it's, hey, we're going to get them an executive coach, we're going to put them into some things that ultimately will continue to develop them out as a leader. And I had some executive coaching where they had come in and assessed, and their readout at that time to the executive level is, hey, this lady can easily be a COO, she can easily be a CCO, like it's a slam dunk, right? But what myself and my boss at that time recognized yep, it's true, and I have confidence that that's true, Nichole, as well. However, I know for a fact that within this particular organization and the DNA of this organization, you would have to run a business unit. So I had to advocate, again, for myself to say, I know I can go and run a business unit, and I want you guys to give me a unit to be able to go and run. And what did that result in? It resulted in them giving me the biggest challenge, probably one of the largest challenges of my life, which was, okay, we'll give you a business unit. We need you to go and run Latin America, which for us at that time was primarily Brazil. So I'll kind of pause there, Mark, but Brazil was it. And then there's all types of learning lessons as it pertains to Brazil.
So were you feeling like, okay, you want a big challenge, goodbye, we're sending you to Brazil? Or were you feeling like, okay, they were giving me a legitimate turnaround or a legitimate opportunity to grow this healthy? What were you feeling when they handed it to you?
I felt two things. Number one, yeah, they're giving me a challenge. Number two, oh my God, I could absolutely fail at this, right? They didn't give me a challenge that was, hey, take on this business unit here in North America, right? That was in my DNA. They gave me a challenge of a business unit, number one, that was a turnaround scenario, right? A business unit, number two, that was in another region, another culture, a business unit number three, that they spoke a whole another language that I did not speak. And then number four, probably, these are the four top things. Number four is that it's a very difficult market. Any person who does business understands that there's corruption, there's complexity. They probably have the most difficult fiscal structure in the world. If you look up who has the most complex tax structure, it's Brazil, right? So I knew that not only am I taking on a challenge that says I've never run a business unit, but number two, I'm running a business unit that has all these aspects that I just outlined. So it was a little daunting, right? In terms of, do I think that this is going to be the failure of me, right? In terms of this run that I've had so far at Arrow, which is, for all intents and purposes, has been a successful one.
It's amazing. It's amazing. How bad was it?
It was bad.
Those are very difficult things. The biggest challenge to the human mind is to be thrown into a different culture and have everything you see be new and different. But how bad were they?
Yeah, they weren't healthy. This was certainly, this was a scenario just high level that was, hey, a company that we had acquired actually about 7 years prior to that, allowed it to run separately, and probably should have never really done that. Normally, we would have integrated the organization pretty quickly. So unfortunately, over time and some leadership changes and some corruption, unfortunately, that had occurred under one of the leaders, it was certainly a build back scenario. It was a build back scenario, not only from the perspective of the financials and the revenue, right? Because we had started to lose year over year. But we were no longer growing, right? Which we had formerly been a growth organization in Brazil, but also gaining the trust of the people. The vocation of things, and I try to say this to people all the time. I can emphasize this more. That's the easy part. The part that says I have to learn the business, I have to learn a tax code or fiscal, structure, right? That's the easy part. The most difficult part in everything you do in business is people in the change management portion. So that change management portion that said that I needed to go into that business, that I needed to gain their trust, that I needed to gain the trust of the suppliers in Brazil, that I needed to gain the trust of our customers in Brazil and of the people to ultimately rally around the strategy that I put on paper that said, this is how I believe that we can turn this business around. So that's the biggest piece. And I actually started with strategy, obviously, the whole thing, strategy, structure, and then process, or strategy, structure, and people. That is ultimately the most important thing. It served me really, really well, but I had to gain a ton of goodwill with the people to wrap themselves around that strategy and ultimately focus on the task at hand.
Well, and it sounds like you had to rebrand yourself again.
I did.
When you had to rebrand yourself and rethink how you worked several times that you've just described to us, do you think your personal experience in going through that kind of a change in work life and personal life and the conversations with mom led to you asking people successfully to change themselves?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love that question, Mark, because I think even going back to the WorldCom situation where I talked about how I felt and how uncertain that I would tell you, out of that was really the first pivotal moment in my career where I had to be okay with uncertainty. That's number one, right? But then also because of what came out of it, right? In that I ended up having a successful career at Arrow, and I could see that I lived to see day number 2. What that did for me was it gave me confidence in never being scared, right, of what could come. As we know in corporate America today, there's shifts all the time. It's not personal, it's business, it's not about you. People are impacted or downsized all the time, and it really has nothing to do with their work ethic. Um, One of the things that I talk to others about, right? Again, because now that I've had a lot of time in my career, I'm very seasoned. As a leader, I am constantly, rolling down lessons, if you will. And those lessons really, as far as this is concerned, really talk to being okay with change, right? And that on the other side of change, it may not look as if it's going to go your way, but ultimately that there is always kind of something on the other side of it. So if you stay focused, I kind of say put your head down. You put your head down and you stay focused, you never know what may come out on the other side of this. So I will tell you where that becomes very applicable is that when you're, as an organization, implementing change and people become weary on the front end of that, they haven't even been impacted yet, but they're already prognosticating on what they believe is going to happen.
Yeah, there are a lot of people in the world that don't understand what you just said, and I may be half one of them in that we think we can just be called on to be a leader because we're so great. We've delivered results, I should lead. But what you just said is changing people is job number 1 in a new leadership assignment, whether it's a turnaround or not. And so if you haven't pushed beyond the bounds of what you did last year for the work result, for the client impact, for the relationships with the clients and prospects, whatever it may be, the new technology you've developed, you're not ready to ask people to make a change in a big way. And so you're just being foolish to think that you're going to be tapped on the shoulder and you're going to go into a management type job or just manage the numbers and manage that nothing blows up. Middle management is not something that we're all excited about anymore. We need leaders to take us to new places, to new adventures, to new vistas as a client or a customer, and we don't need managers anymore. We need leaders. So I think it's a beautiful thing.
I think that I have so many testimonies, not only in what I've experienced myself, but what I've led people through in a ton of uncertainty and seeing what can come on the other side of it. For me, it's about saying uncertainty ultimately presents opportunity. And that's one of the things that I'm constantly trying to talk to folks about, right? So even this pivot that I've made into this new career, if you will, at Included Health, one of the things that I told my former team, because of course they were very upset, I've been around for 17 years, great reputation, one of the best leaders within the organization. Many people were emotional around my exit. But my thing to them was, is change. This is a great example of that, presents opportunity. And so while I'm exiting, some of those people who may not have ever had the opportunity to extend to either my position or the trickle effect that ended up happening as a result, that all of that, is positive. Although we're looking at this event of Nichole exiting as maybe negative for them personally, it was actually positive in that it's presented a lot of opportunities for folks. So I know that's just a small example, but that's ultimately how I leverage all the experiences that I've had and ultimately getting folks wrapped around change as a whole.
The question I have is I look at your background and you've left no stone unturned. Like you said, I don't care what's against me. I don't care what I look like, how I identify. I don't care how I'm typecast. I am going to make sure I've done everything to succeed. It looks like that. Now, I want you to just try to relate to the average Joe, Jane, or whatever. And the person is like, I just want to take a step forward, but I can't get myself to do it. Like, give them some advice. They feel stuck. What's the first couple of steps that's not going to get a doctorate degree or something like that? What do you tell someone like that, Miss Leader of the century in my esteem?
Listen, I would tell you it's a whole bunch of stuff that I have not done. But I think, and I like that you asked the question in that way, I think that I can actually play off of that to say the reason why it looks as if I've done a lot is because of the fact, again, that I was always willing to actually raise my hand, right? I was willing to, even if I didn't raise my hand, if I was tapped on the shoulder to say, can you go and work on this thing? That I would do that. But I think the most important thing is leveraging kind of the lessons learned in whatever it is, right? Like, hey, the learning actually comes in the problems. Like no organization, I don't care if you're Apple, you're gonna have times of challenge, right? You everything was not always, after you've been somewhere for a while, is not always on an upward trajectory, at least based on what your board of directors or your CEO, if it's a private company, or the founders, right, for a smaller company, what they ultimately have on the trajectory of growth, right? We may be growing, but we may not be growing at the rate that we want to. We may no longer be growing, right? All of these different types of challenges that present themselves in business. It's during those times where you're not on the, upward trend that you have the most learning.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes stick-to-itness, for lack of better terms, is a very important thing to have as well, right? To be able to kind of, go through the storm and be able to see ultimately what the backside of that looks like. And usually on the backside of that, some really good things happen. But I think, one of the things that I talk to a lot of professionals. I really like to focus on professionals that are kind of new coming in, straight out of college, young in their careers. And, I know that usually there's some antsiness at that point. You're trying to, tear up the industry or whatever, wherever you are. You're trying to change every couple of years. You want to make more money. You want to be the CEO at 30, all these, crazy things. And one of the things that I talk about is that really we have this concept of the career ladder, but really it's the career lattice, right? And that means that you have to be willing to make some lateral moves, right? But you got to have variety in what it is that you're doing. I see a lot in professionals, specifically sales professionals that will come out, they'll come into, let's say, a junior sales role, and then they want the organization to tell them, hey, the next place you go is sales number 2, and then to senior sales rep, and then to sales manager, and they want you to plot it out for them. Nothing was plotted out for me, right? And I think that that's what we have to get comfortable with, is that there is not a recipe for success. There's not just one recipe for success. You've got to be willing to kind of go along this lattice. And the reason why it's lattice and not just, if you think about lattice kind of goes this way and then this way and then this way and then this way, right? And ultimately, as you're doing that, you're kind of going up. But what you're really doing is you're filling your toolkit, what I call your toolkit of skills, right? And talent and all of that. You're filling it up as you're doing these lateral moves, right? You become more broad, you get more both breadth and depth in terms of your skills, right? In your talent. And ultimately, it makes you more marketable, not only to your internal organization, but to organizations, outside or other opportunities. And you have to be an organization, just other opportunities.
Yeah, you have a lot of exciting things in your personal life, and life includes work, and it includes both. And we like to try to split them apart, but they're woven, and conversations ensue with mom and significant other. Business is not boring when you realize it's part of what happens when you go home. You have decided to do this again. Talk about the decision and how hard it was, and yet again, rebranding yourself and recreating yourself to be something new again.
Yeah, I think this is actually really exciting, because I think people typically are open to changing jobs, but they're not necessarily comfortable with changing industries, which means, it's one thing to have deep domain expertise in sales or finance or marketing or sales operations, so on and so forth. There's something else that says that you don't have expertise in the actual industry potentially that you're making a pivot to. Here's what I would tell you. I think that after you've accomplished a lot in your career and you've reached a certain level, number one, many times you have recruiters, if you will, or what we call headhunters, executive recruiters that are seeking you out. And I have had many of those through the years in which I, respectfully decline. I was on a good run at Arrow, 17 years. All things were great. Again, people still felt that there was runway. There was certainly no need for me to make an exit, right, per se. But I had reached a point in my career where I was open to new opportunities. As my old boss used to tell me, he's like, you're an institution, right, at Arrow. And that's good and it's bad, in some ways, right? Because again, kind of back to the typecasting, I think that, after a while, a pyramid is a pyramid for a reason, right? You kind of get to that top part of the pyramid, and it's kind of like, how many places are you going? But ultimately, how can you kind of jumpstart, the next thing that you ultimately want to do? And it's the right opportunity. The thing that you can be selfish about when you get to this level is that I had a job, right? This wasn't back in the WorldCom days. This wasn't me being in the market looking for a job. When you already have a job and you're basically happy for all intents and purposes with that job, you could be a little bit more picky as it pertains to the opportunities. And this one presented itself, and it was one where I was willing to actually open my ears and listen to what that opportunity was. And it's kind of the best of both worlds, Mark, where it's the healthcare space, but it's really the technology side, if you will, of healthcare, in that, certainly there's been a lens on virtual healthcare, specifically as we have moved into the COVID timeframe. Now, the growth in that industry had already taken off before COVID, but certainly COVID has brought more attention to the navigation in virtual healthcare space. And so I saw an opportunity for me to bring the skills that I have from tech and kind of bring that into healthcare, and a mission that ultimately was compelling to me. At this point in my career, I'm all about how can I make an impact in the world, to be quite honest with you. And so I think that this allows me to bring my skill set mixed with a mission that really is going to help people. And, I feel like I'll thrive from that.
So I know you're going into this very humble, as usual, but you also are going into it with the confidence your mother gave you. The cream's going to rise to the top, and you probably see the teams that you impact both directly and informally. What are the priorities that they have? What are the challenges that you need to come in and add value to right off the bat?
Absolutely. The challenge that exists here is scale. When you're talking about a high growth market, right? Whereas I just came from a market that is, growth, but it's more subtle, right? The growth is a little bit more modest than it is in this space today. So, and then coming from a publicly traded company to a company that's private. And so from that perspective, the proposition is someone like me obviously was attractive to them in the sense that I've come from a public company. I've managed at scale, right? Sales organizations and go to market at scale. And ultimately, this is what they're needing to leverage at this point, just based on the growth trajectory that they've been on, and being able to really scale and put the practices in from a sales and go to market perspective that are needed, right? So we're talking about taking a step all the way back to the infrastructure even that's needed from a go-to-market perspective and an sales enablement perspective. So that's really the challenge, which is exciting to me, in all honesty. One of the things that I liked about my career in the past was being able to build something kind of from nothing. Not that that's what this scenario is, but it certainly is a build scenario versus, kind of status quo, if you will, and just consistently adjusting to market conditions.
Yes, you certainly love to lead new things and a new adventure. Before I ask you the last question, I just want to thank you for your example of being humble enough to traverse the lattice. I think that's a new concept that, clearly spoken, is something we recognize that we've had to do and we need to do more. And also being proactive. You talked about raising your hand first. I want to thank you for that. I think it's a really valuable lesson to raise your hand first, to go into the gray, to be willing to take action and create results when it's unclear. But I think anyone that goes to your LinkedIn page can see that there's a lot of proactivity in your career that has nothing to do with your companies. And I want to thank you for that example. And the last thing I want to thank you for is I love the idea that sometimes we get typecast, and it's important to find our voice, to find our champion. In a small company, it might be a key client to develop a relationship with that will trust you and be your voice and your champion in the market. If it's a big company, it's an executive, and it might be your fourth attempt and your fourth embarrassment and third rejection, and you might have to keep trying. And I just love that. I thank you for that. If you had to give either a small company CEO or director of sales or something that is just starting out, or a larger company, this happens all the time, a larger company that's become comfortable but has decided to grow faster finally and get serious about it, and they don't have everything in place to do so. Those two are fairly analogous. The scale's a little different, but they have to take the first 3 steps to not getting unstuck, but to really creating a breakthrough and growth and how you achieve it and how you scale. What are the first 3 steps that you would give as advice to those people?
Yeah, I think the first thing, and I know this is going to sound cliche, but it's to have a clear strategy for that growth, right? A clear strategy for where we're going and how we're going to accelerate growth. That strategy, and here's the important part, that strategy has to be simple enough and tangible enough, right, that people can absorb it, right? Sometimes we get these big pie in the sky strategies. If we've got 3 things, 3 simple things, grow customers, grow suppliers, I'm giving examples, those things should be able to be easily consumed by all within the organization. But then number 2, right, and regurgitate it. But then number 2, everybody needs to understand how it is that their role impacts that strategy. Mm-hmm. That's the part that's missing many times, is that we've got this great strategy, but we haven't made that real for everyone at every level within the organization. So whether I'm a junior sales rep, I'm a account development rep, I'm a sales support person, how is what I do going to ultimately help us accomplish what that strategy ultimately is? And then third, I would tell you is communication, right? It's communication as to how are we performing to that strategy. Again, we'll come out with a big pie in the sky strategy. Companies do this all the time. And then no one per se knows how it is that we're performing to that strategy or where it is that we need to tweak. And then I guess the last piece, and this is number 4 really, is, fail early. I mean, as we say, fail fast, right? If we need to adjust it, don't think that that strategy can't be tweaked, right? Because all it is kind of what do we think the plan is to accomplish the goal? But sometimes that strategy does need to be tweaked. And if you need to do that, then do it, but do it fast.
Beautiful advice. Nichole Wiley-Marks, thank you again so much. Tell us how we can find and learn more about your previous professional love, Arrow, and also this new venture that you're involved with, Included Health.
Yeah, absolutely. So number 1, you can find me on LinkedIn. Nichole Wiley-Marks on LinkedIn. That Nichole is with H, Nichole, super important. If you want to learn more about Arrow, certainly reach out to arrow.com. There's a lot of stuff out there and content about, things that I've done in the past, as well as includedhealth.com. Includedhealth.com. You can find both of those organizations on LinkedIn as well. And if you go to my profile, you can see a lot of the things that I've done, whether it be, magazine, publications, speaking engagements, etc.
Beautiful. Thank you again.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed the advice of Nichole Wiley-Marks as much as I did. I edited this episode myself because Nichole had so many amazing ideas and 0 fat as she articulated them that we almost couldn't fit it in anywhere near an hour. True story. Bravo, Nichole Wiley-Marks. Your career and you are truly full of breakthroughs. When I spent the day with Herb Kelleher once upon a time, he shortened his famous quote to, "Anybody who seeks wealth as an end in and of itself is always going to be disappointed. What you really should seek is excellence in achievement." The great Herb Kelleher may not have mentored Nichole, but it sure seems like it. Thank you one more time, Nichole. Now, it's our time to go out and create the breakthroughs in our work life.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. And if you enjoyed it, please share this episode with a friend that needs a breakthrough. Post this on social media and add my website or tag my YouTube page. or just text markspencercook.com to a friend, or message that link on Instagram right now. Also, make sure to subscribe on my site at markspencercook.com to stay up to date on all the latest advice on how to unstick priorities to create breakthroughs. I'm so grateful that you listened today. And remember, you have people rooting for you. They love you and want you to make your breakthrough. That includes us too. Take the first step. Now, you know what time it is. It's time to go create a breakthrough for your work in life. And we'll see you there.